Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. What does it feel like when a city has its breath taken away? Not just by frigid weather, but by sudden, shocking violence that cuts into the lives of neighbors and friends. In Minneapolis, there's a texture to the streets that doesn't show up in social media clips. Day after day, in bitter cold, people have come together, protesting, marching, and organizing neighborhood watches. Their gatherings have been sparked by a wave of federal immigration enforcement in the city and by two fatal shootings that have shaken the community. On January 7th, ICE agent Jonathan Ross fatally shot 37-year-old Renee Good, a Minneapolis resident. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner ruled her death a homicide. Video evidence has raised serious questions about whether the force used was justified. Then, on January 24th, Border Patrol agents killed 37-year-old Alex Preddy. Federal officials initially claimed Preddy violently resisted and brandished a gun, but video footage and independent reporting later showed those claims were false. Preddy was holding a cell phone, not a weapon, when he was tackled and shot. The discrepancy between the official account and the evidence has become a flashpoint for protests. In recent weeks, journalist Hamilton Nolan has been on the ground in Minneapolis. He's written about what he's seen and heard in his Substack newsletter, How Things Work. We'll start with what he saw on the ground, then ask what, if anything, Detroit can learn from Minneapolis. Hamilton, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So you were reporting from Minneapolis during weeks of protests and labor actions in the middle of the winter. And people are still protesting, I should note. And you have just left recently. What did the city feel like while you were there?
So I went to Minneapolis last week primarily to cover the general strike, which a coalition of labor unions and activist groups had called for January 23rd as a response to the many weeks of ICE activity in that city. And what I saw during the days I was there was an incredibly impressive community organizing effort citywide that has really been rooted in the activist groups and labor unions that have long been based in Minneapolis, but has expanded to pull in, I think, regular people from every corner of that city who are seeing their city essentially invaded by federal agents who are kidnapping their neighbors and who find that intolerable. And so I have reported on similar ICE watching activities in different cities, but I have to say that the people of Minneapolis in some ways are the most impressive that I have seen, partly because it's so freezing there.
Yeah. What were the temperatures like while you were there?
On the day of the general strike, which was the 23rd, was, I think, the coldest day that I've ever experienced in my life. It was close to negative 20 degrees outside. Just standing outside for a moment, as you can imagine, can be life-threatening in that kind of temperature. And yet they succeeded in putting 50,000 plus people into the streets of downtown Minneapolis, marching through the streets. They succeeded in putting thousands of people at the Minneapolis airport for an action where 100 clergy got arrested. They succeeded in putting a large number of protesters in front of the Whipple Federal Building where ICE is based. So just the ability to turn out many, many thousands of people like that on a day where the temperature was that extreme is something that anybody has to be impressed by.
Wow. I mean, yes, organizers of actions like this are always concerned about whether the weather will deter people. And it sounds like this was somehow mobilizing despite the brutality of the conditions. A lot of people are encountering this moment, Hamilton, only through headlines, though, about these protests or unrest. What are those headlines missing about who exactly is showing up and why?
I think what I saw when I was in Minneapolis was really a community of regular people who are alarmed at an extreme situation that has been imposed on their city from the outside, from the federal government in this case. It's very much not a situation where, there's a small band of radicals who are causing protests in Minneapolis. I mean, this is a city that, yes, on the one hand, has a very strong history of organizing and political activism, but the extent of the community response to what's happening to ICE is really being driven by the outrageousness of what ICE has done in that town, the way they are kidnapping neighbors, the way they are approaching non-white people on the street for their papers, as they've done in other cities. ICE is being extremely aggressive in Minneapolis, and what you're really seeing is that regular people, just regular decent people who are not even particularly political perhaps before this, have mobilized to a huge extent in that city because they've seen the extremity of what their city is facing right now.
Hamilton, in your writing, you've said that ICE is police. Historically and operationally, what do you mean by that, especially for listeners who think of ICE as something separate from local policing?
I think if we think back to 2020, the demands of the street protests that arose in 2020 after George Floyd, obviously there's decades worth of history of this in America, but the demands that many of the organizers were making in 2020 of defunding the police went to the heart of the fact that America is over-policed and aggressively policed, and the police are used as a political tool. And I think what we are seeing with ICE under this new Trump administration is an extreme version of that, right? ICE has become essentially a private army for the federal government. And it is almost a cartoon version of the worst aspects of what people were trying to reform in policing more broadly. And so I think that the long tail of the way that the demand to defund the police was harshly rejected by the political establishment. Now we are seeing a manifestation of some of the consequences of that in the way that ICE was hugely funded and is being deployed in racist ways and in ways that do not care very much for the Constitution. I think that this is going to cause another political reckoning that hopefully will make a lot of the political establishment think a little more deeply about the free hand that America has always given to its police structures of all types.
Of course, there are protesters not only in Minneapolis but around the country right now who want to abolish ICE. But that still is somewhat of a radical notion for a lot of Americans who may be unhappy with what's going on right now, but would not go so far as to say they want to abolish ICE. I mean, some people like ICE because they want to remove folks from this country who did not go through the proper channels to get here. Why should those folks, according to certain protesters, take the statement of abolishing ICE more seriously?
I don't want to speak for anyone, but I can almost guarantee that if ICE came to your city, to anyone's city, and carried out their operations in the way that they are operating in Minneapolis and they've operated in Chicago and New Orleans and other places, that the residents of that city would immediately have a backlash against what ICE is doing. They are conducting themselves in such a grotesque and outright racist way that, Minneapolis is the proof. As I said, regular people in Minneapolis, not particularly political people in Minneapolis, are demanding for ICE to be abolished because they have seen firsthand the outrageousness of the way that ICE is carrying out its duties. It's gone far beyond any reasonable form of immigration enforcement. And so I think that one reason why ICE has not been deployed to a lot of Republican-leaning cities is because they know that it would erode the support for ICE that exists in the Republican base if people saw that in their own neighborhoods.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. My guest is journalist Hamilton Nolan. He's been on the ground in Minneapolis, spending time with neighbors and embedding in the streets after residents were killed there by federal immigration officers. Hamilton, you mentioned the general strike. I know that's your bread and butter as a labor reporter. On January 23rd, organizers called for this general strike. Historically, a general strike means workers across sectors withholding labor to exert pressure. So talk to us a little bit more about what that looked like in Minneapolis in practice, who participated, who couldn't, and what actually changed that day. I mean, you have the knowledge here of many decades of labor activism to contextualize this.
Right. A general strike, you think of strikes at a single workplace, and the concept of a general strike is sort of workers across all sectors shutting down a city. And this is something that is not a pipe dream. It's something that America has had historically. If you go back a century through labor history, you've seen in various cities general strikes, mostly in the early 20th century, that did in fact shut down cities, sometimes for long periods of time. Now, it's not something that we have seen much in modern America as the labor movement itself has weakened. And people have started to kind of regard the idea of general strike as a left-wing pipe dream. But I think what we saw in Minnesota, in Minneapolis on January 23rd was probably the closest thing to a general strike that I have seen in my reporting career as a labor reporter over more than 10 years. I don't know that there's extremely hard statistics on it, but hundreds of businesses shut down across Minneapolis that day. Tens of thousands of people went in the streets, and a huge coalition of local labor unions, from teachers to airport workers to hotel workers, across many, many sectors participated in that strike, did not go to work today. And so I think Minneapolis is proving that the concept of a general strike is not only possible, but may be necessary at this point in America's history, because the level of danger that I think America's basic constitutional rights and democracy are facing right now is really something that has percolated into the mainstream. And I think what Minneapolis has done is to show everybody who is out there saying, what can we do? What can we do? That, look, there is a historic model for this, rooted in labor activism, rooted in the power that we all have as working people, and the power to withdraw our own labor and therefore to cause the entire machine of a city to come to a halt. I mean, this is something that can actually work, can actually make a statement, and is actually possible, as Minneapolis showed us.
Hamilton, you're describing a really significant moment, and I'm wondering if you think that national and so-called legacy media outlets have acknowledged this moment with the weight that you're describing it.
I think that they are certainly getting closer to that point. And I think that if you followed the reporting throughout the past year, say, as Trump has taken power and started to carry out his agenda, you've certainly seen an increase in the level of alarm, even in very mainstream straight news publications. And so I think that we are getting close to that. I think, there's a lot of people on the left and probably people in minority communities and other communities who would say, hey, we've been warning about this for years. We knew this was coming. But ultimately, it is important that regular people who aren't necessarily tuned into politics as much, start to become alarmed and start to acknowledge the level of danger. And I do think we are seeing that, in cities where people are able to see these things happen firsthand. You have huge levels of alarm. National polling tells us that all of these operations are extremely unpopular. National polling tells us that people are alarmed about the Constitution and about the state of our democracy. And you're seeing very mainstream Democrats, who certainly are not radicals, starting to talk about things like abolish ICE in ways that they definitely would not be if they weren't reading those polls. So I do think that the public perception is catching up to what's happening right now.
It does feel that way, but I was referring actually to this specific general strike, and if you feel like that got enough coverage and acknowledgement and assessment for its significance?
It's a good question. I don't think so. And one of the reasons it probably didn't is because that the morning after the general strike is when Alex Priddy was shot and killed. And I think that specific case kind of blew up and took over the story. And it's obviously very important. But the fact that it happened so soon after the general strike kind of stepped on the news a little bit. And it is, both are very significant. But yes, you're absolutely right that, the fact of the general strike itself is very significant. The ability of that coalition of labor unions in the city, along with activist groups in the city, to pull off an event that big on very short notice, in very bad weather, in those conditions, in these political conditions, is extremely significant. And I hope, that does not get lost in the sauce.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. My guest is journalist Hamilton Nolan. He's been on the ground in Minneapolis talking with neighbors and embedding in the streets after residents were killed by federal immigration officers. We're going to take a quick break and come back to talk about folks in Minneapolis and in Detroit and elsewhere who feel unaffected by this. At what point will they feel affected? That's next. It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. And in recent weeks, journalist Hamilton Nolan has been on the ground in Minneapolis. He's been writing about what he's seen and heard in his Substack newsletter, How Things Work. And we've been talking about what has been happening there and what it means for other places. And that's what we're going to get into now a little bit more. Hamilton, we were talking about the general strike on January 23rd. And some people went to work that day and felt largely unaffected. Based on history and what you're seeing now, when do those folks begin to feel the effects of conflicts like this? What do you think, in other words, is the tipping point where structural issues like this, ICE's brutality, when do those things start to feel less distant for people?
Sure. I think it's always a spectrum. And if you read the history of fascist governments, if you read the history of Nazi Germany before World War II, there was always a significant portion of the population that just went on living as usual. And in fact, the ability of a certain part of the population to continue living as usual is a key to those types of governments maintaining power. And so to some extent, there will always be people who just don't care. I think that the more people are personally affected, the more people see their own neighbors, people that they interact with in their own cities being subjected to the type of oppression that ICE is carrying out. I think that will change a lot of people's perspective. And I think also you raise a good point from the perspective of activists and unions and people who are trying to turn up the pressure on the government. Part of the way to do that is by bringing this issue to the doorsteps of those people who maybe would like to ignore it. And so things like general strikes are also a spectrum in the sense that the bigger you can make them and the more disruptive you can make them and the more meaningful you can make them, the more you make regular people reckon with the larger issues that they're trying to highlight.
I want to give you the uncomfortable task of thinking about the future here. Detroiters know that moment when a crisis draws the country's attention, like the bankruptcy here, and then life goes on with long-term consequences still shaping the city. In Minneapolis, how long do you think people might be protesting in the streets? And is there a way for them to bring ICE and the federal government to justice? Or is this the kind of thing that's going to ebb and flow and go on for a long time?
I have not seen any indications that the people of Minneapolis will quit protesting until ICE leaves their city. The determination that I saw among the people of Minneapolis in the streets of Minneapolis was extremely strong. And so the only way that I can see this ending is with ICE leaving Minneapolis. And I think that there is a consciousness of people in many cities that, it's not a win if you just drive ICE out of one city and they go to another city. This is a national issue that we are ultimately going to have to address nationally. And cities like Minneapolis and like Detroit that have strong histories of organized labor, strong union communities, the labor movement can be the basis of long-term resistance to things like this. And so I do think that cities that have a strong history of organized labor kind of have the muscle memory of carrying out these long, hard fights, marshaling the resources, marshaling the people, and hunkering down and doing activism that, in fact, is going to have to carry on for years. I don't think that this is going to stop while Donald Trump is president, that's for sure.
Of course, there are some Republicans in Congress now who are unhappy with what's happening in Minnesota. And I do want to take just a moment to acknowledge Alex Priddy, who worked with veterans. He was a nurse at a VA hospital. I heard a prayer that he gave yesterday to a dying veteran. It was beautiful and just tear-jerking. And, I think about the way that people have described him as just caring about people, having deep empathy. Do you think that his life lost, of course, we cannot diminish any of the people who've been killed by ICE, and it's more than just Alex Priddy, and it's more than just Renee Good. But do you think that this moment that Alex Priddy may become a martyr of sorts?
I think that's very possible, and I think he already has to some extent for the reasons that you said. He's such a sort of admirable person in the way that he carried out his life, and historically, movements often have a figure like that, a Rosa Parks type figure who is the one that really shifts public perception and clarifies the public's perception of just how bad things are. Because, contrast everything that you just said about Alex Priddy with the fact that as soon as he was killed, Stephen Miller came out and other government officials came out and accused him of being essentially an assassin and a domestic terrorist who was out to kill police. I mean, the contrast between those two things, I think, is so stark that it really does produce potentially a breaking point in the consciousness of regular people. And so, yes, he could very well be that martyr, and I hope that he is, because that would mean that somebody else doesn't have to be.
Journalist Hamilton Nolan, his Substack newsletter is called How Things Work. Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's The Metro on WDET. Coming up, reading about history isn't just about learning from the past. It's about shaping it. A lecture series in honor of a civil rights pioneer reminds people of that collective power. We'll learn about that next. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. And this is The Metro. We'll be right back after the news.